Sheriff John Mason was a man forged in the fires of service. He had spent over 30 years in the line of duty, transitioning from a military police officer to a sheriff of Riverside County, a small, tight-knit community in a part of the world that rarely saw the darkness of criminal underworlds. Mason was a man of few words, his actions louder than any speech. A face weathered by the years, hardened by sacrifice, yet undeniably compassionate to those who mattered. At 52 years old, Mason wasn't the young man he used to be. His body had borne the brunt of his years in service. His back ached from lifting too many bodies, his hands were calloused from gripping weapons, and his mind had seen more horrors than any human should ever bear. But even with all that, he still carried himself like a man in his prime, with a deep sense of loyalty to his job and the people he served. He was a constant, steady, and dependable, the kind of man everyone in Riverside County trusted to watch over them. Mason's true partner was never just a man, it was Max, his steadfast German shepherd. Max had been at his side for nearly a decade, through the heat of every operation, the grit of countless dangerous missions. Max wasn't just a working dog, he was family. Together, they had faced the worst of the worst drug dealers, human traffickers, and every other villain who dared to make Riverside County their playground. But it wasn't just Mason who relied on Max for protection and loyalty, it was the people too. When Mason and Max patrolled the streets, there was a palpable sense of peace, an unspoken confidence that no matter how dark the world became, they were in capable hands. Even with Max always by his side, Mason knew that life had a way of throwing the unexpected his way, and it was about to do just that. It all started with a tip, the kind of tip Mason had learned to trust over the years, reliable, concrete information from an informant whose word had proven valuable more than once. This tip, however, carried with it an urgency that sent a shiver down his spine. A human trafficking operation was suspected to be running out of a dilapidated barn on the outskirts of town, hidden away in the middle of nowhere. It was the kind of operation that needed to be stopped before more lives were torn apart. Mason's gut told him it was worth investigating, and so he didn't hesitate. He called on his trusted Deputy Ray Collins, a man who had been with him through thick and thin, a bond that went far beyond professional respect. In many ways, Ray was like a brother to him, but that trust, that bond they had forged over the years, was about to be shattered in the most unimaginable way. The night Mason and Ray set out for the barn, Mason had no idea that this would be the last time he would ever trust his deputy. The cold air stung as it cut through their jackets, the stars obscured by thick clouds, leaving the world draped in shadows. The wind rustled the trees around them, creating an eerie soundtrack to their tense journey. As they drew closer to the barn, Mason's instincts kicked in. Something was wrong. His gut twisted with unease, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling as a sense of dread settled in. The area was too quiet. No animals, no movement, not a sound in the air except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The silence was unnerving, almost as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Mason reached for his radio, his hand trembling slightly as he prepared to call for backup. But before he could even utter a word, a figure lunged from the shadows. The blow to the back of his head was brutal, unexpected, sending Mason crashing to the ground with an impact that stole his breath. His vision swam in and out of focus, his senses dimming as his body screamed in protest. For the first time in years, Mason felt a wave of pure, unadulterated fear. His mind yelled at him to stay awake, to fight back, but his body betrayed him. Darkness quickly consumed him, a suffocating, relentless wave that drowned out everything else. The last thing he remembered was the taste of blood in his mouth, mingling with the cold ground beneath him as his world slipped away into nothingness. When Mason slowly regained consciousness, it was to the sound of distant, muffled voices echoing faintly in the space around him. His senses were dulled, and the first thing he became aware of was the unbearable weight of his body pressing down onto the cold, unforgiving dirt beneath him. Every inch of contact with the ground seemed to send sharp waves of pain shooting through him, making him wince involuntarily. His head throbbed with such intensity that it felt as though it was being squeezed in a vice, every pulse exacerbating the pressure. His limbs, unresponsive and heavy, refused to cooperate with his attempts to move. His hands, bound tightly behind his back, ached with the cruel sting of the zip ties cutting into his skin. Desperately, he tried to shift his body, to break free from his restraints, but the plastic bands were so tight they cut off any hope of escape. Two men stood in front of him, speaking in low tones, unaware that Mason was conscious. "You sure he's out?" one of the men asked, his voice gruff. "He's done. We leave him here, he's as good as dead," the other replied, a coldness to his tone that sent a chill down Mason's spine. The sheriff's heart raced. He couldn't let them get away with this. He had to fight to survive. But he was too weak and his mind was fogged with pain. The two men continued to argue, discussing how they would dispose of him. Mason's senses dulled once more, and his vision flickered. The last thing he heard before slipping back into unconsciousness was the words, "Let's go. Get him out of the way." Meanwhile, back at the sheriff's office, Max was uneasy. The dog, who had been resting quietly in his kennel, suddenly stirred. His nose twitched, his ears flicked, and he began pacing, each step more agitated than the last. Max's instincts were never wrong. Something was wrong. Mason had been gone too long, and Max, ever loyal, felt a surge of urgency. The bond between Max and Mason went far deeper than the typical connection between a handler and his dog. It was something instinctual, something that transcended simple training or commands. Max could feel Mason's absence as if it were a part of him. The same way he had always felt Mason's presence, a steady, rhythmic pulse, like the thrum of a distant heartbeat. When the sheriff was in danger, Max sensed it without hesitation. Like a sixth sense that connected them on an emotional level, Max's body tensed, and with a sharp, urgent bark, he signaled to the officers nearby. His call was loud, a clear plea for attention, but they didn't understand, not like he did. They couldn't possibly know what he was feeling in this moment. He wasn't just any dog. He was a K9, trained for more than just obedience. He was intricately attuned to the emotional rhythm of his handler, able to sense the nuances of Mason's thoughts and feelings. And right now that connection was weak. The pulse he had always felt was faint, distant. Something was wrong. Without hesitation, without a second thought, Max freed himself from his kennel. The sound of the lock giving way was barely a whisper against the storm of urgency in his chest. He bolted from the sheriff's office, his paws pounding against the floor, his body pushing past everything that stood in his way. There was no time to waste. His mission was as clear as the instinct driving him. Find Mason. Max raced through the streets of Riverside County, his paws hammering against the pavement with relentless speed, his nose working furiously to catch any trace of his partner. The moon hung behind a thick veil of clouds, casting the world in dark silhouettes, but it didn't matter to Max. The darkness only fueled his determination. There was no time to consider the shadows or the cold. All that mattered was the overwhelming instinct driving him forward, a primal need to find the one person he had pledged to protect with every ounce of his being. His search took him through the familiar streets of the town, then out into the dense woods where Mason had last been seen. The chill of the night air nipped at his fur, biting through the layers of his thick coat, but it did nothing to slow him down. Max's focus was unwavering. He had been trained for moments like this, to track, to search, to find. It was more than a skill. It was his calling. His training had prepared him for this exact moment when everything was on the line and only his instincts could lead the way. As the hours wore on, Max's keen sense of smell struggled to keep up with the fainting trail. The scent grew weaker, the evidence of Mason's passing nearly lost in the wilderness. But Max didn't hesitate. He pushed forward, his muscles burning as he leapt over fallen branches and forced his way through thick underbrush, his paws carrying him through the darkness without a second thought. There was no time to waste. His handler needed him, and he wasn't going to stop until he found him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Max emerged into a clearing deep in the woods. There, lying motionless on the ground, was Sheriff John Mason. Max's heart clenched in his chest, and for a moment he thought it might stop altogether. The sheriff's face was pale, his breathing shallow, but the subtle rise and fall of his chest told Max what he needed to know: he was still alive, just barely. The faint scent of blood mixed with the earth, but Mason was breathing, and that was enough for now. Max's mission had been completed, but the fight was far from over. Max approached cautiously, his instincts telling him to be gentle yet urgent. He nudged Mason's face with his snout, his tongue licking the sheriff's cheek in a frantic attempt to rouse him from unconsciousness. The dog's eyes, usually calm and focused, now held an unmistakable desperation. His movements were a mixture of panic and hope. He needed Mason to wake up, to stir, to show that he was still there. He needed his partner back. The cold, unyielding night air pressed in around them, but Max paid no attention to the chill that settled in his fur. His world had narrowed down to the broken form of his handler, the one person he had always trusted. His heart raced as he nudged Mason again, this time with more insistence, each breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. He refused to give up. He couldn't. Not when Mason was so close to him, still hanging on by the thinnest thread. Mason groaned softly, the sound barely audible. His eyelids fluttered weakly, struggling against the heaviness of unconsciousness. His eyes, once sharp and clear, were now unfocused, clouded by the fog of his injuries. But then, as if responding to Max's touch, a whisper escaped his lips, faint but unmistakable. "Max." At the sound of his name, Max's tail began to wag furiously, the emotion behind the movement clear and raw. Relief surged through him like a tidal wave, and for just a moment everything seemed to right itself. His partner was alive, the bond between them unbroken. But there was no time to celebrate. The reality of the situation slammed into Max with brutal clarity. Mason's injuries were severe and they were still out in the woods. It wasn't safe. Mason couldn't stay there, not like this. Max's training kicked in like a well-oiled machine. The shift from panic to action was immediate. His mind was clear now, there was no time to waste. He couldn't afford to be anything but focused. Without a second thought, Max turned around, his muscles taut with purpose, every inch of him honed for the task ahead. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about getting Mason to safety, and he was the only one who could do it. Max didn't look back as he sprinted toward the nearest point of safety, his body moving with precision, each stride carrying him closer to the goal. He wasn't just running for himself. He was running for Mason, for the one person who had always been there for him, who had trusted him with everything. Max wouldn't let him down. Not now, not ever. Max shot forward through the woods like a streak of lightning, his muscular legs propelling him with an urgency that matched the gravity of his mission. His sharp, focused eyes darted from side to side, scanning the dense trees and shadows for any sign of movement, every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig sending his senses into overdrive. He could feel it in his bones. Mason needed him. His partner was out there, injured and vulnerable, and Max wasn't going to stop until he found help. Time was slipping away and every passing second felt heavier, more pressing. The forest seemed endless as Max pushed forward, his body pushing through thick underbrush and brambles without hesitation. But then, like a beacon in the distance, Max spotted it, a distant glow. Headlights, the sharp beams of light cutting through the darkness, illuminating the trees ahead. A truck was coming down the road. It was the brake he needed. Without a second of hesitation, Max bolted forward, his paws pounding against the ground with all the power he could muster. The air whipped past him as he charged toward the road, driven by one singular purpose. As the truck neared, Max launched himself directly into its path, forcing the driver to react instantly. The tires screeched in protest, the heavy truck skidding to a halt just inches from the dog's body, narrowly avoiding a collision. The driver's voice, sharp with surprise and confusion, rang out through the window. "Hey, what's the matter?" "With you?" he shouted, his eyes wide with disbelief as he locked eyes with the determined dog standing in front of him. But Max didn't hesitate. There was no time for explanations. His mission was far too urgent. Without a second thought, he gave a sharp, commanding bark, a call to action that pierced the stillness of the night. Then, with a swift turn, He spun on his heels, his body already surging forward back into the woods. Max glanced over his shoulder one last time to ensure the driver was following. The man, now understanding the gravity of the situation, revved the engine with urgency. The truck's headlights flickered to life, illuminating the narrow, winding path ahead as the driver followed Max, trusting the dog to lead him to where he was needed most. Max didn't slow down for a second. His focus was razor-sharp as he darted through the trees, the ground beneath his paws a blur of motion. The weight of his mission pressed on him with every step. Mason was out there, vulnerable, and the clock was ticking. He couldn't afford any missteps. Every instinct in his body screamed for him to move faster, but he was careful, measured. Recklessness could cost Mason everything. Behind him, the sound of the truck's engine roared to life, following Max's every move. The headlights sliced through the darkness, casting long, shifting shadows across the dense woods, illuminating their path as they pressed deeper into the night. Max's stride was unbroken, steady, his heart pounding with purpose. He knew every step he took brought him closer to his partner, and that was all that mattered now. Max led the way, his pace unrelenting, his body pushing through the thick trees, with single-minded determination. His paws hit the ground with precision, each step bringing him closer to the clearing where Mason lay. The sound of the truck's tires crunching against the forest floor faded into the background, as Max's focus sharpened on the task at hand. His breath came in quick bursts, his chest rising and falling rapidly, but he didn't slow. He couldn't. Not now. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Max reached the clearing. There, lying motionless on the ground, was Sheriff Mason. His face was pale, his body still, but the faint rise and fall of his chest told Max everything he needed to know. Mason was still alive, though barely. Max skidded to a halt beside him, his paws shifting in the dirt as he crouched low, his eyes never leaving the sheriff's form. Panting heavily, Max stood guard, watching over Mason with the kind of loyalty only a partner could understand. He didn't need to look back to know the driver was there. He could feel the presence behind him, the sound of the truck's engine still humming in the background. The help Mason so desperately needed had arrived, and Max had done his part. Now, it was time for the rest to take over.